The rain had begun in the small hours of the morning and showed no signs of relenting. It fell in fine sheets upon the rolling lawns of Wexley Court, a Jacobean mansion turned Edwardian folly, whose windows glimmered faintly through the mist like watchful eyes. The gravel drive, usually so crisp and bright beneath the autumn sun, was now a sodden ribbon of mud and puddles. Yet within the great house, a fire crackled in the library, and the scent of polish and cigar smoke lingered, as if Wexley Court were determined to preserve its dignity against the damp weather beyond. Colonel Geoffrey Arbuthnot, retired from His Majesty's army and master of this ancestral seat, had summoned a most curious collection of guests for the weekend. That in itself was not unusual. Wexley Court had often hosted shooting parties, musical weekends, and even political gatherings. But this assembly was different. There was no common thread of sport or politics. Rather, it was a gathering of personalities, each bound by some invisible tie to the colonel's past. And though no one could have said precisely why they were there, each had accepted the invitation, compelled perhaps by curiosity, perhaps by vanity, or perhaps by the allure of the colonel's renowned hospitality. In the drawing-room, Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, tall and severe, adjusted her gloves with the precision of a duelist. She had been a celebrated beauty in her youth and retained the sharp cheekbones that had once adorned the society pages. Her eyes, however, betrayed a nervous energy, flitting restlessly toward the French windows that rattled faintly in the gale. Opposite her sat Mr. Leonard Grant, a financier of some reputation, or perhaps notoriety. He was a plump man, with hair that gleamed unnaturally under the lamps, and he laughed too loudly at his own remarks. His wife, Margaret, perched beside him like a bird of delicate plumage, her silken gown whispering with each movement. She said little, but her eyes darted from guest to guest as though cataloguing their every flaw. On the hearthrug stood Dr. Oliver Price, a country physician whose practice stretched across several villages. His presence was more a matter of necessity than of friendship. Colonel Arbuthnot's health was notoriously uneven, and the good doctor had long since learned that a patient of means was a patient whose whims must be humored. Still, there was something almost too careful about the way Dr. Price spoke, as though weighing each word for hidden consequences. Beside the fire, idly turning the pages of an illustrated magazine, was Miss Clara Dawson, the colonel's young niece. Her golden hair and charming dimples made her the center of admiring glances, though there was an air of calculation about her that sat oddly upon her otherwise innocent features. She had inherited little beyond her looks, but even so, she comported herself with the confidence of one accustomed to being indulged. And then, at last, the colonel himself entered the room. His military bearing had not deserted him despite his advancing years. His mustache was trimmed with a soldier's neatness, and his gaze, though clouded by time, retained its habit of command. He wore his decorations proudly, as if to remind his guests that whatever else he might be, he had once been a man of action and distinction. "My friends," he declared, spreading his arms as though addressing a battalion rather than half a dozen guests, "welcome to Wexley Court. You will find no sport outdoors today, I fear, but within these walls we shall make our own amusement. Supper will be served at 8. Until then, you may amuse yourselves as you please. The library, the billiard room, the music room, they are all at your disposal." There was a murmur of polite appreciation. Drinks were fetched. The guests settled into uneasy companionship. Yet beneath the veneer of civility, there lingered an unspoken tension, like the taut string of a bow. It was during this subdued interlude that Clara spoke. "Uncle Geoffrey," she said lightly, "you promised to show me the diamonds this evening. You mustn't forget." At once, the room shifted. Lady Eleanor's eyes narrowed, Mr. Grant's laughter faltered, and even Dr. Price seemed to glance away. Colonel Arbuthnot himself grew stiff, as though surprised by the mention of the jewels in company. "Ah," he said after a pause. "Yes, the diamonds. My little collection. Nothing of great value, you understand. Just trinkets from my days in India." But his words rang hollow. Everyone present knew that the Arbuthnot diamonds were no mere trinkets. Whispers had long circulated of a necklace once belonging to a Maharaja's queen, acquired under circumstances not entirely clear. Whether gift, bargain, or plunder, none could say, but the stones themselves, large, fiery, and set in antique gold, were beyond doubt of considerable worth. "You will see them, Clara," the colonel said brusquely, "but not tonight. They are locked away, as jewels of value ought to be. Perhaps tomorrow, when the weather clears." Clara pouted, but said no more. Yet the subject of the diamonds, once raised, hung over the room like a spectre. Each guest, in his or her own way, seemed affected. Lady Eleanor resumed her glove adjusting with unusual vigor. Mr. Grant drained his glass in a single swallow. Mrs. Grant smoothed her gown compulsively, while Dr. Price consulted his watch. It was as though each were suddenly conscious of secrets best left unspoken. The storm outside intensified, battering the windows and rattling the old house to its foundations. At supper, the talk was forced, punctuated by nervous laughter and long silences. Even the Colonel seemed uncharacteristically subdued, his gaze wandering often toward the locked cabinet in the far corner of the dining room, a cabinet said to contain many curiosities of his travels. And as the guests retired for the night, none could know that before the weekend was out, the Arbuthnot diamonds would vanish without trace, and a far darker fate would befall one among them. The rain did not abate. Rather, it gathered itself into a steady siege. Wexley Court lay beset on all sides, ditches brimful, the lane a glistening ribbon, the elms bending and whispering their old secrets to the gale. Within, lamps were lit early and curtains drawn against the drear. Footmen padded to and fro with trays. The rhythm of a great house resumed its age-old beat. Yet something in the air, perhaps no more than the persistent hiss of rain, seemed to whisper of interruption. Captain Arthur Hastings, who had arrived later than the other guests on account of a recalcitrant motor car near Dowerby Cross, took a certain comfort in the civilized routine of dressing for dinner. He was not, by nature, a nervous man. Yet he had felt, while removing his wet boots and listening to the rain dash against the casement, the curious sensation that one more person than was visible was present, some silent fellow-traveler who had slipped in with the storm. He had known Colonel Arbuthnot in a casual way, through the club, and through a certain dinner at which Hastings had, to his chagrin, mistaken an under-secretary for the ambassador himself. The colonel had laughed, warmly but with a faintly pitying tolerance of the old soldier for the younger man's blunders. Later, Hastings had found himself liking the colonel's talk of India, his crisp recollections, his stern, almost worshipful nostalgia for discipline and iron. At 7:45, the guests assembled in the great hall before passing to the dining room. Hastings, descending the broad staircase, observed them with the mild curiosity of the guest who is not, himself, part of the house's complex web. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb stood by a Chinese screen, her shoulders perfectly set, reading a letter which she folded at Hastings's approach with a tiny, precise movement, too precise, he thought, for a trivial note. The financier Leonard Grant was already expansive, rather too expansive, about the claret he had been promised. Mrs. Grant, pale and fastidious, wore pearls which she adjusted now and again with a small, habitual touch at the clasp, as though to reassure herself of their presence. Dr. Oliver Price, drying his spectacles by the fire, had the amiable air of a man who has just heard something diverting and is attempting, with poor success, not to smile. Clara Dawson flitted about, bright as a bird, yet there was a watchfulness in her that Hastings, who had once been accused by a certain fastidious Belgian of observing without perceiving, nonetheless detected. The colonel arrived last, fading a little in the lamplight, but still every inch the commander. "We must make shift to be merry within doors," he cried. "The rain will have its way tonight. Frobisher," this to the butler, "see that the decanters go round unblushingly. We will defy the weather." Supper was excellent. Hastings found himself seated between Mrs. Grant, who spoke very little, and Clara, who spoke perhaps too much. The talk, however, never rose easily. It rose, rather, like a balloon that is continually caught by downdrafts. Twice the colonel, following some reminiscing path of his own, began to speak of India and jewels and a certain Maharaja who had once, only once, been beaten at polo. Twice he checked himself, and twice Hastings saw Dr. Price's eyes flicker, then become studiously incurious. It was after the second course that the thing occurred which, though trivial in itself, seemed in retrospect the first trumpet in that night's fanfare. A footman, hurrying, caught his sleeve upon the corner of a sideboard. There was a small clatter. A bowl of wax meant for sealing, part of some antiquated writing set displayed in the dining room, tipped and rolled. A sliver of pale wax fell and skittered across the parquet, coming to rest by Mr. Grant's shoe. He stooped clumsily, laughed too loudly, retrieved it, and placed it upon the sideboard with a flourish that earned him a brief, cold glance from Lady Eleanor. "Clumsy of me," said the footman. "Not at all," said the colonel, though his brows had drawn together. Not at all. At 9:30, coffee was taken in the library. The storm had risen. The windows rattled with a persistent little tremor that set Hastings's teeth somewhat on edge. Twice, the house lights dimmed and revived. "Old wiring," said Dr. Price, who had a manner of speaking on all subjects as though each had been taught to him by an authoritative uncle. "You'll be fortunate, Colonel, if something worse than a dimming does not befall you." "It will not," said the Colonel shortly. "We have a generator. Wexley Court, Dr. Price, may be old, but it is not helpless." Conversation disposed itself in little eddies and pools. Lady Eleanor and Mrs. Grant took possession of the blue sofa. Mr. Grant stood by the mantel, his back to the fire, one elbow raised in a manner that proclaimed both ease and proprietorship. Clara moved from bookcase to bookcase, extracting a volume here and there, then replacing it, less as a reader than as a restless surveyor of composition. Dr. Price selected a chair near the French windows, which were heavily curtained against the black pane beyond. Hastings, who had never been able to resist the warm invitation of a hearth, drew near the fire and stood, for a time, within earshot of the Colonel. It was then that Clara spoke again of the diamonds. "Uncle Geoffrey, you promised," she reminded him, her tone half teasing, half childish. "If not tonight, then when? It is the one amusement that does not require fair weather." There was a pause. Lady Eleanor's hand, in its elegant glove, ceased its small movements and lay perfectly still. Mr. Grant's laugh was immediate and a shade too hearty. "Oh, the famous Arbuthnot stones!" he exclaimed. "I've heard of them since I was a boy. A legend, like the crown jewels, only more romantic. Do not be ungenerous, Colonel. Let us have a glimpse." The Colonel's face, which had been weathered to a ruddy brown in the service of empire, seemed to acquire a grayish tinge. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at Clara with an expression Hastings could not read. "They are not in the cabinet here," he said at last, with deliberate care. "They are in the steel safe in my study. There is, I may tell you, no cause for anxiety. The precaution is not excessive. The world, Mr. Grant, is full of men who profess admiration for that which is not theirs." Grant laughed, though his eyes did not. "Very right. Very right. And your safe, English make." "American," said the Colonel shortly. "A Lincoln and Ames, installed in 23. Combination and key." "Ah, both," murmured Dr. Price, polishing his spectacles. Clara clapped her hands softly, like a child who has been offered sweets. "Then do show them, Uncle." "No," the word came with unexpected force. "No, not tonight. Tomorrow, perhaps. I am a little fatigued." He rose, beckoned to Hastings. "You have an eye, Captain Hastings," he murmured, with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Come with me a moment. I should like your view on a map I have of the lower fields. The rain may flood the east ditch if the sluice gate is not attended to." It was the sort of practical, manly errand a host might very well assign to a guest he liked, and Hastings followed readily. Yet as they left the library he had the impression, absurd no doubt, that half the company would have followed too, had politeness permitted. He thought of Grant's eager tone, of Lady Eleanor's arrested hand, of Clara's bright insistence, of Dr. Price's cautious questions. He did not, as yet, think of danger. The Colonel's study was at the end of the left corridor, a square, grim room lined with law books, atlas folios, and the trophies of a younger, bloodier age. It smelled faintly of leather, tobacco, and a spice Hastings could not name. There was a Turkish rug upon the floor, a massive desk, and, handsomest of all, a great steel safe behind a panel. The panel, ingenious but not new, was operated by a spring hidden within a carved wooden elephant on a side table. The Colonel, perhaps to demonstrate, perhaps to reassure, pressed the elephant's eye. The panel slid back with an oiled whisper. The safe crouched within like some glowering beast. "Combination and key," said the Colonel again. He glanced at Hastings. "Do you know, my dear fellow, I am an old man. I do not always trust myself. Therefore," a small, grim smile, "I do not keep the combination in my head as some do, thinking it a proof of cleverness. I keep it written, sealed, where I may consult it, if necessary, and the key, also in a place not obvious. A second key exists in the bank at Dowerby. Paranoia, you will say. Perhaps. But there are fortunes in stones as in stocks, and I trust locks more than I trust men. He did not open the safe. He closed the panel, showed Hastings a map of the East Ditch, and discussed sluice gates for 5 minutes with the absorbed fussiness of the English country gentleman. Then they returned to the library. By 10 o'clock, the ladies declared themselves fatigued. The house party broke up with the small courtesies that are the very mortar of such assemblies. Lady Eleanor, in the hall, dropped her handkerchief, white lawn, faintly scented with violet. Mrs. Grant retrieved it and returned it with a smile that was, perhaps, a shade too sweet. Mr. Grant laughed twice at nothing in particular. Dr. Price inquired of the colonel, sotto voce, whether the draught mixture he had left might be increased by a quarter ounce during this damp spell. The colonel thanked him and said he would not, after all, require it. At 10:30, Hastings took himself off to his room, oak-paneled, comfortable, with a view, now black, over the south lawn. He lit a cigarette, listened to the rain, and found his thoughts returning, again and again, to the diamonds. It was not cupidity. Rather, it was the sense that those stones, so much talked of and so carefully guarded, were part of the house's very essence, like some organ upon which the whole, in secret, depended. He undressed, wound his watch, and slept. He woke at a little after 1 to a sound that was not the rain. It was nothing dramatic, no cry, no crash. It was a soft, metallic click, as of a latch. He lay still, alert. There was a faint light beneath his door, the night bulbs the maids left in the passages. He rose, drew his dressing gown about him, and opened the door. The corridor was empty, and very still. At the far end, a thread of light shone beneath the door of the colonel's study. Hastings hesitated, then, feeling the folly of creeping about in other men's houses, prepared to return to bed. It was then he saw, upon the carpet runner, a damp, narrow crescent, the faintest of footprints in mud, almost invisible save that it darkened the pale wool. It was small, smaller than a man's, and pointed inward toward the study. He could, of course, have gone at once to the study door, flung it open, and demanded an explanation. He did not. It is not in the English character to accuse his host of furtive movement at 1 in the morning. Instead, because he had a soldier's sense of small useful acts, he knelt and placed his finger, lightly, upon the faint crescent. It was cool. He straightened, considered, and glanced, with the idle habit of a man who has shared rooms in barracks, at the handle of the door to the linen closet across the corridor. Upon the brass, under the night bulb's pallid glow, glimmered a thin, tacky smear, like cooled candle wax or soap. He touched it. It broke away in a flake. Hastings's heart beat, very slightly faster. He told himself sternly that a house at night is a collection of trivialities that loom absurdly large in the imagination. He returned to his room. At some time between 2 and 3, the electricity failed with a sigh. The darkness that followed was heavy and absolute. A minute later the generator coughed itself to life. Light returned in a weaker register, steady but sullen. At 7, a knock like the crack of doom sounded on Hastings's door. He sprang up, shrugged himself into a dressing gown, and opened. It was Frobisher, the butler, grey, impassive, but with an odd stiffness to his face as though the muscles would not fully obey him. "Captain Hastings, sir. The colonel desires that the gentleman attend him in the study, at once." The gentlemen, Hastings, Grant, and Dr. Price, assembled within 5 minutes. Mrs. Grant and Lady Eleanor were not far behind, though Frobisher had not summoned them. Clara arrived last, white and trembling, though whether with excitement or fear Hastings could not tell. The colonel stood by the panel where the safe lay. He was fully dressed. His collar was a trifle awry. He did not bid them be seated. "Ladies, gentlemen," his voice was level but very cold. "We have been robbed." There was the little outcry such announcements produce, the shocked wife's "Oh!" from Mrs. Grant, a half-laugh that died at the lips of her husband, a muffled exclamation from Clara, the sibilant intake of breath from Lady Eleanor. Dr. Price said, prosaically, "Good Lord." The colonel pressed the carved elephant's eye. The panel slid back. The safe door, massive, implacable, was shut. "Observe," said the colonel. "Shut and yet empty." He worked the combination. Numbers turned with crisp certainty beneath his hand. He drew a key from his waistcoat, not an obvious place, and inserted it. The lock turned with a sticky reluctance. The door opened. Within, on the bare shelf where a red morocco case had lain for 20 years, there was nothing. The shelf was perfectly clean save for a small thread of something pale, wax, which clung, almost invisibly, to the inner rim of the keyhole. On the lower shelf lay a packet of papers, undisturbed, a revolver in a velvet tray, a string of inferior pearls, a sealed envelope labeled "Combination" in a hand that Hastings recognized as the Colonel's. The envelope was intact. "The red morocco case is gone," said the Colonel. "The diamonds within it are gone. They were here at 9:45 last night. They are not here now." "By Jove," said Hastings blankly. He found himself looking, not at the empty shelf, but at the edges of the safe door, the lock, the hinges. He bent a little, breathed in. There was a smell, faint, acrid, not tobacco, not oil. Something like rubber warmed upon metal, and, yes, an echo of violet, so faint that it might have been the ghost of a scent worn elsewhere. "Who has the combination?" asked Dr. Price. "I," said the Colonel grimly. "No other." "And the key?" "I," said the Colonel again. "There is another at the bank. It has not left its place for 2 years." Grant, who had been uncharacteristically silent, recovered himself with a sort of bluster. Well then, could some Confederate, some fellow with a clever ear, have listened? There are men who do nothing else, listen to locks, make a wax impression, dash it all, why look at me? No one had, in fact, looked at him, until he said so. Then they did. Grant flushed an angry, unbecoming red. "I beg your pardon," he muttered. Lady Eleanor, very white, held her gloves, this morning, gray, upon her lap. Her eyes were on the safe door. Her lips barely moved. "If the envelope is sealed," she said, "then the combination was not taken. And yet the safe is open." "Quite so," said the Colonel. "It was opened by one who knew the numbers, or by one who did not require them." "Did not," Dr. Price began, then stopped. "Precisely," said the Colonel. "Forced. By professional means. Look at the tongue of the lock." Hastings did. To his layman's eye, the lock seemed sound. But at the very tip of the tongue, where the bolt engages, there was a bruise as delicate and merciless as a surgeon's cut. "Not a jemmy," murmured Dr. Price. "Something finer." "Something," said the Colonel, "warmed." There was a small silence. Outside, the rain lessened. A pale, mean light came through the high windows. Frobisher coughed, no more than a servant's discreet signal that he existed. The Colonel turned to him sharply. "Frobisher, call Mason. Ask him where he was between midnight and 5. And tell Mrs. Baines I shall require all the maids in the hall within 10 minutes. We will have the servants' movements as carefully as we shall have the guests." Hastings, whose natural impulse was always towards chivalry and the assumption of innocence, said, "But surely, Colonel, surely this is the work of some professional, some London fellow who has marked the house and—" "Captain Hastings," said the Colonel, not unkindly, "the lane to Dowerby is a river. The switchback at Fell End is impassable. The telephone lines failed for an hour in the night. No man unknown to this house has entered or left since 5 yesterday afternoon. We are, as the Americans say, shut in. I have the statements of the night groom and the gate lodge. If a thief is here, he is here still." "In that case," began Grant and stopped. "In that case," said the Colonel coldly, "we must treat one another with perfect frankness. I ask you all to account for your movements after we parted at 10. He produced a blotter and a pen. It had the air of a regimental roll call. In another mood, Hastings would have smiled. Now he did not. "Dr. Price." "I was in my room by 10:15, said Dr. Price. "I read for half an hour, The Lancet, if you must know. At 11, I took a little whiskey. I slept shortly thereafter. I woke at, 2:20, when the lights failed. I rose, went to the window, and saw nothing whatever. I slept again." "Very precise," said the Colonel. "Lady Eleanor?" Lady Eleanor's voice was dry as autumn leaves. "I retired at 10:15. I wrote letters, 2 of them, which I placed upon the hall table at 11 for the Morning Post. I am, A cold little smile. A light sleeper. I heard the generator at 2, I should judge. I did not leave my room thereafter. Mr. Grant. Grant blustered. Mrs. Grant, with a curious swiftness, intervened. My husband was with me from 10:30 until 1. He read. I could not sleep and asked him to tell me of the investments he recommends for my cousin. At 1, we both slept. At 1, repeated the colonel. Ah, Captain Hastings. Hastings gave his account. Bed at 10:30, a wakefulness at a little after 1 when he heard a latch, and the faint light beneath the study door, then the return to bed, the generator at 2. He hesitated over the footprint and the smear upon the handle. Then, deciding the moment for delicate scruples had passed, he spoke of them. A smear, said the colonel quickly. On the closet handle? Yes. Like wax, cold. The colonel's eyes went to the sliver on the inner rim of the safe keyhole. We are children, he said softly, but with a venom that startled Hastings. Children playing with clever toys. Very well, Clara. Clara, who had been pale, flushed suddenly. I went to my room, or rather, to the little morning room beyond it. I had promised to darn a glove, Aunt Eleanor's glove, for tomorrow. I remembered at the last a tear in the seam, here. She indicated, with a nervous finger, the inner edge of the glove Lady Eleanor now wore. I did it, then I read, then I slept. I did not stir again. I swear it. Mrs. Grant. Mrs. Grant's account was her husband's. Talk till 1, sleep thereafter. I did not wake when the lights failed, she added. I never do. Very well, said the colonel. You will all, if you please, remain convenient. No one leaves the house without my permission. I go now to telephone Dowerby, if the lines will accommodate me. I shall also ring the police at Braychester. In this matter, we shall have formality. He turned on his heel. The guests rose, uncertain, muttering. Hastings, whose instincts are older than any science, moved to the safe and examined it again. He knelt very carefully and ran a cautious finger along the sill just inside the safe's lower lip. There, too small to see at a moment's glance, was a tiny grit of dried mud, no larger than a pinhead. He straightened, felt suddenly that he was being watched, and turned. Lady Eleanor's eyes were upon him. They were cold, level, and, if he was not mistaken, faintly contemptuous. She rose, adjusted her glove with that exact, economical movement he had seen last night, and left the room without a glance toward the safe. By 9, the house had become a hive. Servants passed and repassed. The hall clock ticked ostentatiously. The telephone, after a period of sulky silence, condescended to work. The colonel spoke to the police, his voice clipped and military. The replies, unheard by the others, were none the less clear in their import. The weather made movement slow. The inspector would come. He would not come quickly. It was just before 10, when the first search, the kind of futile search undertaken by people anxious to do anything rather than think, had been completed, that Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper, came to the study in a state of rigid propriety scarcely concealing panic. Colonel, sir. The blue drawing-room. If you please. They went, Hastings with them, for he was at the colonel's elbow. The blue drawing-room, so named for its chairs, which were indeed blue, though faded, was neat as a ship's cabin. On a small table by the window lay 2 letters addressed in Lady Eleanor's fine, uncompromising hand. One to a charitable committee in town, the other to a solicitor. Beside them, as though placed with deliberation, lay a key, a small, old-fashioned key of worn brass. My desk key, said the colonel, in a strangled voice. I left it, where I always leave it, in the drawer of the hall table. Who removed it? Who placed it here? No one answered. Mrs. Baines folded and unfolded her hands, a rare breach of her usual control. There is, also, this, sir. She held out, on her palm, a shred of white lawn, a handkerchief's corner, torn. Upon it, delicate and unmistakable, was the faintest trace of violet scent. The diamonds, said the colonel softly, are gone, and the thief, if not a stranger, is one of us. In the doorway, the wind pushed at the curtain. For a moment the rain made a fine, frantic pattern upon the window like breath upon glass. Hastings, whose mind, if not as brilliant as a certain little man's he knew, was nevertheless honest and steady, felt the shape of events settle around him like a net. He thought of the footprint, small and damp, of the smear upon the closet handle, of the pale wax upon the keyhole, of the old brass key laid where it should not be, of Lady Eleanor's letters, of Clara's nervous needle, of Mr. Grant's bluster, of Mrs. Grant's pearls, incessantly touched, of Dr. Price's cool little observations. Above all, he thought of the safe, shut, then open, then empty. He thought, and he wished, very much, that Hercule Poirot were there. Outside, the rain relented at last, and in the hush that followed, the clock in the hall struck 10, each stroke like a summons. The case of the disappearing diamonds had begun. The morning after the theft dawned pale and reluctant, as though even the sun hesitated to look too closely upon Wexley Court. The rain had ceased in the small hours, leaving behind a heavy stillness broken only by the drip of water from the gutters and the occasional groan of the old timbers adjusting to damp. The lawns were awash, the gravel drive pitted with small lakes, and the air had the raw metallic taste that follows a storm. In the dining room, breakfast was served with the usual formality, yet no one had the appetite for it. Lady Eleanor sat stiffly erect, touching nothing on her plate save the weakest of teas. Mr. Grant applied himself to bacon with an enthusiasm meant to demonstrate unconcern, though the clatter of his fork betrayed his nerves. His wife ate nothing at all, but once, when she thought herself unobserved, she pressed her handkerchief to her lips and closed her eyes tightly. Clara Dawson picked listlessly at toast, her golden head bent, her gaiety extinguished. Dr. Price alone attempted conversation, but his small remarks about the storm and influenza in the county died one by one in the oppressive silence. The colonel entered last, a figure of implacable gravity. His eyes swept the table, lingering on each face in turn, and he said only, "The police will come from Braychester when the roads allow. Until then, no one leaves the house." There was no protest. Each guest, in his or her way, had understood the implication. They were all suspects until proved otherwise. It was precisely then, when the mood had settled into grim endurance, that Providence, or fate, intervened in the form of Hercule Poirot. The sound of a motor car laboring up the sodden drive drew every head toward the window. A moment later, the crunch of wheels upon gravel announced the arrival of a visitor. Clara, curious despite herself, darted to the window and gave a small cry. "It is a cab," she exclaimed. "From the station, surely. Who can it be, in this weather?" The colonel rose abruptly, his jaw set. Visitors were unwelcome now, but when the butler ushered the newcomer into the hall, all was transformed. For the small, neat man who stepped into the house was no ordinary traveler. He wore a well-brushed hat, a perfectly tailored overcoat, and carried himself with a composure at once modest and immense. His mustaches, magnificent, curled, and gleaming, declared his identity as loudly as any herald. "Hercule Poirot," he said, bowing slightly, "at your service." Even the storm seemed, in retrospect, to have been arranged for his dramatic entrance. The colonel stared. "Good heavens! Poirot, I had no idea." "It is a little unexpected, said Poirot, smiling. "But permit me to explain. I was at Braychester, on my way to London after certain business in the north. The storm, she made it impossible to continue. The inn at Dowerby," he shrugged, his hands eloquent. "How do you say, full to bursting? A fellow traveler spoke to me of Wexley Court, of the hospitality of Colonel Arbuthnot, and so, I take the liberty." The colonel's severe expression softened into reluctant welcome. "My dear fellow, you are known to me by reputation, though we have not met. Your fame goes before you." Poirot bowed again. "It is kind, but already I perceive there is trouble here." Lady Eleanor's lips tightened. Mr. Grant gave a nervous laugh. Clara clapped her hands softly, almost childlike in her relief. "Monsieur Poirot," she cried. "Then it is Providence indeed. You shall find the diamonds." The colonel, taken aback, shot her a glance of disapproval. Yet Poirot merely inclined his head. "Ah, the diamonds," he murmured. "So it is theft, then. I arrive at a house where a great treasure has vanished. It is, how do you say, in the air?" Poirot insisted, before any details were given, upon observing the company as they sat. He walked slowly round the table, his head a little to one side, his eyes, bright, inquisitive, moving from face to face. He noted Lady Eleanor's rigid posture, Mr. Grant's uneasy joviality, Mrs. Grant's pallor, Clara's eager light, Dr. Price's faintly amused detachment. Then he came to Hastings, who had risen in astonishment at his friend's arrival. "Mon ami Hastings!" Poirot exclaimed. "But it is a surprise, indeed." "Hercule!" cried Hastings, grasping his hand warmly. "What luck, what extraordinary luck that you should be here. By Jove, I can't tell you how glad I am. You see, there's been, well, a deuced queer business. The Colonel's diamonds, gone as if by magic." Poirot twinkled. "Magic, Hastings, is only the word we use when we do not yet perceive the method. Sit, my friend. Tell me all, and we will see if the little gray cells may illuminate." In the library, the scene of last night's gathering, the Colonel laid the matter before Poirot with military brevity. He described the safe, the combination and key, the discovery of emptiness at 7 in the morning. He showed the sealed envelope containing the written combination, the unbroken seal. He pointed out the faint bruise upon the lock's tongue, the shred of wax, the brass key found beside Lady Eleanor's letters. Poirot listened without interruption, nodding gravely, his fingertips pressed together. When the Colonel finished, Poirot bent to examine the safe himself. He touched the lock delicately, sniffed the faint acrid smell Hastings had noticed, and retrieved with tweezers the tiny grit of dried mud that Hastings had found. He placed it carefully in a small envelope. "Bon. And now, Colonel, you will permit me to ask questions of each guest, and also of your servants." The Colonel assented grimly. "You will have full liberty. I care for nothing now but the recovery of the stones." Poirot's mustaches quivered. "Recovery, yes. But also truth. For without truth, what is possession? A man may hold the diamonds, yet not be at peace. No, truth first, then recovery." Poirot did not begin with the servants, as the Colonel expected. Instead, he gathered the household in the drawing-room. There, with a little bow, he announced, "Mesdames, messieurs, it is my custom to observe before I inquire. So I will ask only one thing of you. Tell me, in one word, what you felt when you heard that the diamonds were gone." The responses came, hesitantly at first. Lady Eleanor, disgust. Mr. Grant, shock. Mrs. Grant, fear. Clara, excitement. Dr. Price, interest. Hastings, surprise. Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien. Each word is a window. Later, we shall see what view it reveals." Then, with an apologetic smile, he dismissed them. When they were alone, Hastings burst out, "I say, Poirot, that was rather thin, wasn't it? A single word. What can you make of that?" Poirot wagged a finger. "Mon cher Hastings, you see but you do not observe. Each word was chosen, or slipped, according to character. Lady Eleanor is proud. Her disgust is moral. Mr. Grant thinks only of appearances. His shock is for himself. Mrs. Grant is timid. Fear is natural to her. Clara, Clara! She is too eager, she betrays herself. Dr. Price is clinical. Interest is his mask. And you, Hastings, you are always honest. Surprise." Hastings colored slightly. "Well, dash it, it was surprising." Poirot smiled. "And therefore you speak the truth. That is why I value you, mon ami. In this house of shadows, you are the clear mirror." At that very moment, Frobisher the butler appeared at the door. His face, though carefully schooled, betrayed unease. "Monsieur Poirot, Colonel, sir, Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper, has discovered something in the morning room. She thought it best you should see at once." They followed him. On a small table beside the window, amid sewing things and a half-darned glove, lay a curious object, a scrap of red Morocco leather, torn at the edge, unmistakably the corner of a jewel case. Poirot bent, lifted it delicately, and held it to the light. His eyes narrowed, the neat mustaches twitched. "Eh bien," he murmured softly. "So the case of the disappearing diamonds begins to reveal its first shadow. The question is not only who has taken, but who has wished us to see that it was taken." And with that, Hercule Poirot, most meticulous of detectives, entered fully into the mystery of Wexley Court. The library at Wexley Court, ordinarily a place of quiet scholarship and mellow comfort, had been transformed into a tribunal. Heavy curtains shut out the pallid daylight. The fire hissed softly in the grate, fighting the damp that clung even indoors. At the center stood Hercule Poirot, immaculate as ever, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his mustaches bristling with order and pride. He had arranged 3 chairs before him in a line, like supplicants before a magistrate, and there he proposed to seat each member of the household in turn. Colonel Arbuthnot, though by temperament a man of action, had wisely conceded command of the proceedings to Poirot. "Very well," he said brusquely. "If anyone can unearth this scoundrel, it is you. Question them all, Poirot, guests and servants alike." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Merci, Colonel. But let us not speak of scoundrels yet. In every theft, there is also fear, desperation, perhaps even love. We shall see." Hastings, seated discreetly to one side with notebook in hand, thrilled with the familiar sense that a drama was unfolding, one in which he would witness every delicate step of Poirot's dance. She was the first to be summoned. Lady Eleanor entered with her head held high, her gloves immaculate, her lips pressed thin. She sat rigidly in the chair, as though at a court-martial, and fixed Poirot with an unblinking gaze. "Madam," said Poirot with a courteous bow, "I must ask you to recount your movements after 10 o'clock last night." "I retired to my room," she said promptly. "I wrote 2 letters, both of which lie upon the hall table to be collected. I did not stir thereafter." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Except, perhaps, to place a small brass key beside those letters?" Her gaze flickered for the first time. "That key was nothing to do with me. I found it on the morning-room table when I went down early. I moved it to the hall, thinking it had been dropped there carelessly by a servant." "Très intéressant," murmured Poirot. "And yet Mrs. Baines insists she found it among your letters. You see the confusion." Lady Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Are you accusing me of theft?" "Non, madam. I accuse you of pride. And pride, it blinds the eyes. Tell me, do you wear violet scent?" Her expression changed, almost imperceptibly. "I do." "What of it?" Poirot merely bowed his head and dismissed her. Grant entered bluffly, his laughter forced but loud. He dropped into the chair as though it were his own club armchair. "Now look here, Poirot, let's have done with this nonsense. I know a thing or two about safes myself. Combination, key, American make. You'll never keep a professional out if he sets his mind to it." "Ah, monsieur," said Poirot, "you are a financier, are you not? You understand values. Perhaps you also understand temptation." Grant flushed. "Nonsense. I've my own money. More than Arbuthnot's trinkets are worth, I'll wager." "And yet," said Poirot softly, "you were most eager last night that the jewels should be shown. Eager beyond politeness." Grant laughed again, too loudly. "Well, who wouldn't be curious? A fellow hears talk all his life of the Arbuthnot diamonds. Naturally, he wants to see them." Poirot leaned forward. "Tell me, monsieur, where were you between midnight and 1? Grant hesitated. "In my room. With your wife." "Yes, with my wife." Poirot smiled faintly. "It is curious. She says the same. Exactment the same words. Couples, they are sometimes too much in agreement." "I thank you, monsieur." If her husband was bluster, Mrs. Grant was silence. She entered quietly, her eyes downcast, her pearls faintly trembling at her throat. She seated herself as though for a confession. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "your husband assures me he was with you until 1 o'clock. Is that true?" "Yes," she whispered. "Quite true." Poirot tilted his head. "Yet you did not sleep well?" She glanced up, startled. "How do you know that?" "The clasp of your pearls," Poirot said. "You touch it constantly, like one who seeks reassurance." "That is not the gesture of calm repose, madam." She colored faintly. Yes, I was restless. The storm kept me awake." "Or fear?" Poirot murmured. "Tell me, madam, of what are you afraid?" She pressed her lips together, said nothing more, and with a trembling hand adjusted her pearls again. Poirot dismissed her with a grave bow. The physician entered with brisk cheerfulness, spectacles polished and manner composed. He looked, thought Hastings, like a man who has made himself amiable to patients for 20 years, concealing impatience behind smiles. "Doctor," said Poirot, "you were in your room at 10:15?" "Yes. I read the Lancet, as I mentioned to Colonel Arbuthnot." Poirot nodded. "And you did not hear footsteps, or voices, or the turning of a latch?" "No more than the generator at 2. I noted it and returned to bed." "Tell me, Doctor, do you often prescribe drafts to Colonel Arbuthnot?" Dr. Price blinked. "Occasionally, for sleep. He rarely takes them, however." "And yet last night," Poirot observed, "he declined a draft he had requested earlier. Curious, n'est-ce pas?" Price's smile did not falter. "Perhaps the Colonel wished to remain alert. He guards his property well. Or feared something might happen to it." Price spread his hands. "That, monsieur, is for you to decide." She entered nervously, her youth and beauty shadowed by guilt or fear. She twisted her gloves in her hands, her blue eyes darting to Poirot's face with almost childish hope. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot softly, "you were in the morning room donning a glove?" Yes, I was. Aunt Eleanor's glove. She tore it." "Indeed. And the Morocco fragment of the jewel case, how came it to lie upon the same table where you sat?" Clara's face flushed. "I don't know. I swear it wasn't there when I went to bed." Poirot leaned closer. "Or perhaps you wished us to think it was not there. Mademoiselle, you are young. Youth thinks deception is easy. But it leaves always a trace." She burst out, "I only wanted to see them, the diamonds. I never touched them. I swear I didn't." Poirot raised a calming hand. "Tranquil, mademoiselle. We shall see." Last of all came Frobisher the butler, Mrs. Baines the housekeeper, Mason the groom, and 3 maids. Their alibis were simple. The maids swore they had been asleep since 10. The groom had remained in the stables through the storm, Mrs. Baines had retired early, and Frobisher himself had been in his pantry until midnight, then to bed. None, on the surface, seemed capable of penetrating a modern safe. When the questioning ended, Poirot stood by the fire, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back. Hastings, restless, approached him. "Well, Poirot, what do you make of it all?" Poirot sighed. "It is like a tapestry, Hastings. At first, only threads, violet scent, a key, a scrap of leather, a footprint. But soon, the pattern will emerge. Each guest has told me the truth, or a part of it. What remains is to decide whose truth conceals a lie." He looked toward the window, where the rain had ceased and pale sunlight fought through the clouds. "Mon ami," Poirot said softly, "already I see the outline of the hand that has taken the diamonds. But it is not yet enough. There is still the matter of motive, of psychology. For jewels, they are never stolen only for their sparkle. They are stolen for the passions they awaken, in envy, in fear, in pride." Hastings leaned forward eagerly. "And the thief?" Poirot's mustaches quivered. "Patience, Hastings. Let us observe a little longer. Soon, the mask will slip." The morning at Wexley Court passed in a kind of brittle quiet, the sort of silence that comes not from peace, but from tension so thick it seems to coat the air. Meals were eaten with little relish, conversations faltered, and every sound, the clink of a spoon, the creak of a floorboard, carried a weight it would not ordinarily bear. Colonel Arbuthnot maintained a rigid dignity, but even his military precision could not disguise the strain that marked his eyes. Hercule Poirot moved calmly through this atmosphere, as though he were strolling through a garden of roses rather than a nest of secrets. He studied every detail, pausing here to finger a velvet curtain, there to glance at a muddy footprint on the tiles, or to tilt his head toward the faint trace of scent left behind by a passing guest. Hastings followed him faithfully, not entirely sure what Poirot saw, but convinced nonetheless that each gesture held significance. It was after luncheon that Poirot drew Hastings into the study once more. The open safe, now a silent monument to violation, loomed in the corner. Poirot gestured at it with delicate fingers. To the ordinary eye, it is empty, mute. But to mine, it speaks. He produced a small magnifying lens and bent close to the lock. Hastings, obedient, knelt beside him, though he saw only cold steel and the faint bruise they had noticed before. Poirot gave a small triumphant murmur and held out a speck caught on the rim. It was a thread, almost invisible, white and twisted. "Cotton," Poirot said softly. "Not from a rough cloth, but from something finer. A lady's handkerchief, perhaps. Or from the donning of a glove." Hastings could not help himself. Clara Dawson's glove. Poirot's mustaches twitched. "You leap, Hastings, always you leap. It may be Clara. Or it may be another. What matters is not the fiber itself, but how it joins with the wax upon the lock, with the key among Lady Eleanor's letters, with the footprint you saw in the corridor. Each detail is a thread, and together they weave a design." Poirot requested then to see the 2 letters Lady Eleanor had left for the post. He examined them with a care so minute it bordered on reverence. Tilting them beneath the light, he revealed faint traces of wax rubbed into the edges, as though the paper had been pressed against a sealing stick not yet hardened. Hastings frowned, bewildered. Then the same wax that was used on the safe? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wished us to think so. They returned to the corridor where Hastings had spotted the faint footprint. Though blurred now by traffic, Poirot measured it carefully with his tape. It was smaller than a man's, narrower even than Lady Eleanor's. "Not Clara," he murmured. "No, this belongs to a servant's shoe. We must not dismiss, Hastings. We must eliminate." Dr. Price appeared just then, spectacles catching the light. "Still measuring carpets, Poirot? I fear they will not return the jewels." Poirot smiled serenely. "Carpets, they are like human nature, Doctor. They show where we have trod, and sometimes where we should not." Price chuckled and walked on, humming faintly, but Poirot's gaze lingered with quiet intensity. "Notice, Hastings, how he mocks. The guilty often laugh, to belittle what threatens them. Yet I do not say he is guilty. Not yet." Later, Poirot found Clara in the music room, her hands lying limply upon the piano keys. Her eyes were red, her face pale. "You must believe me," she cried. "I never touched the diamonds. I only wanted to see them." Poirot seated himself beside her. "I believe you wish to see them, yes. That is true. But tell me, why were you in the morning room at midnight?" She shook her head desperately. "No, not midnight. Earlier, yes. But not then. At midnight I was in my room." Poirot's voice softened. "And yet the fragment of the Morocco case was placed upon the very table where you sat. Who would do so, mademoiselle, unless they wished suspicion to fall upon you?" Clara's eyes widened in horror. "Someone wants to ruin me," Poirot said quietly, "or to protect themselves." That night, Poirot reviewed his discoveries with Hastings in the privacy of his room. "We have 4 details: wax, fiber, the key, and the footprint. Each small, yet precise. Together they form a pattern, not confusion. Someone arranged the fragment of the case deliberately to throw suspicion. Someone plays at theater, Hastings, cleverly, but not too cleverly. Cleverness, when overdone, betrays itself." "And the thief?" Hastings asked eagerly. Poirot smiled enigmatically. "I see already the outline of the hand that has taken the diamonds. But it is not yet enough. We need motive, psychology. 4 diamonds are never stolen for sparkle alone. They are stolen for pride, for fear, for love. One more clue, Hastings, just one, and the design will be complete." He stood, straightened his cuffs, and looked out over the drenched lawns gleaming silver in the moonlight. "This theft," he murmured, "is more than theft. It is also a confession." The morning after Poirot's discoveries brought no relief to the tense household. The storm had passed, but it left behind an atmosphere sodden with suspicion. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth seeping through open windows, mingled with the faint perfume of polish and tobacco that clung to Wexley Court. Servants went about their duties in silence, the rustle of skirts and clatter of trays louder than usual in the stillness. Guests avoided one another in the corridors, meeting with forced politeness and swift retreat. Poirot, however, was at his most serene. He appeared at breakfast neat as ever, mustaches gleaming, patent leather shoes without a trace of damp. He surveyed the table with bright, watchful eyes, and then addressed Colonel Arbuthnot. "This morning, mon Colonel, we begin not with safes or footprints, but with the human heart. For it is there, always, that the true crime is born. The colonel grunted. Very well. Do as you see fit. Hastings noticed Clara Dawson's hands trembling slightly as she buttered her toast. Lady Eleanor's lips were pressed thin, and Mr. Grant was once again too hearty in his laughter. Mrs. Grant avoided her husband's gaze, her eyes fixed on her plate. Dr. Price seemed amused, but his amusement had a brittle edge. After breakfast, Poirot requested that each guest remain in the drawing-room. He took up his post near the fire and began, as gently as a priest, to prod at the lies concealed beneath civility. He began with Mr. Grant. Monsieur, you are a financier. You deal in stocks and shares, in risks and rewards. Yet I discover that last year you suffered certain losses. Substantial losses. Grant flushed and shifted in his chair. Speculation, that's all. Every man speculates. Poirot inclined his head. Ah, but speculation requires capital. And when capital is diminished, temptation whispers. The Arbuthnot diamonds, they would cover many debts. Grant spluttered, but before he could reply, Poirot turned his gaze to Mrs. Grant. And you, madam, you wear pearls. You touch them always. But these are not so fine as they once were, n'est-ce pas? An imitation, perhaps, of a better string sold in haste. Her face went pale. That's not true, she cried, but the quiver of her voice betrayed her. Madam, said Poirot softly, I accuse you of nothing, but I say this, the loss of wealth, it breeds fear, and fear breeds secrecy. Next he addressed Lady Eleanor. Madam, your glove, it was torn. It was Mademoiselle Clara who mended it. Yet you, a woman of precision, how did you tear it? A snag? Or perhaps, when you held something not meant to be held? Lady Eleanor's eyes glittered with disdain. I will not be interrogated like a criminal. Poirot bowed slightly. It is not interrogation, madam. It is psychology. You are proud, you despise weakness. You would never steal for money. But to punish another? To preserve your dignity? Perhaps. Her face grew white as marble, but she did not reply. Poirot turned last to Clara, whose eyes brimmed with tears. Mademoiselle, you are young, impulsive. You speak of the diamonds with too much eagerness. That is your truth. But I must tell you, someone has sought to cast suspicion upon you. The fragment of the Morocco case, the glove, the thread of cotton, all these were placed to point toward you. But they were placed too neatly, too conveniently. She gasped. Then you believe me? Poirot raised a finger. I believe that youth is often foolish, but not always wicked. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Dr. Price spoke, smiling faintly. A most entertaining performance, Monsieur Poirot. You weave a net of insinuations, but do you have proof? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Proof, docteur, comes last. First comes the revelation of motive. For every one of you has one. Debt, pride, fear, ambition. And somewhere among you lies not only the thief of jewels, but the thief of truth. Hastings, watching, felt a shiver run down his spine. He had seen Poirot strip away pretenses before, but never had the air seemed so thick with unspoken confessions. Poirot folded his hands. We are nearer, Hastings. Much nearer. The diamonds have vanished, but it is the lies that leave the truest trace. And lies, mon ami, always surface. That night, as the guests withdrew in uneasy silence, Poirot whispered to Hastings, Tomorrow we set the little trap, and then we shall see who walks into it. The day after Poirot's probing questions began with a sky washed clean of storm, the lawns glittering in dew, and the air sharp with early autumn. Yet inside Wexley Court, there was no sense of freshness. The atmosphere was more oppressive than ever. The household had grown weary of suspicion, yet no one dared to speak freely. Every smile was brittle, every laugh a shield, every silence loaded with implication. Poirot, however, seemed untroubled. He spent the morning walking the corridors with his delicate step, pausing to examine the smallest details, an ink blot on the hall table, a faint scuff upon the stair rail, a scrap of torn envelope in the wastebasket. Hastings followed him, increasingly restless. Dash it, Poirot, he said at last. "This is a house on edge. One can feel it. It's as if every one of them is hiding something." Poirot raised a finger. "Precisely, mon ami. But it is not only diamonds that are hidden here. It is truths, passions, little jealousies, old wounds. The theft, how do you say, has pulled away the mask." It was at luncheon that the mask cracked. The guests sat together at the long table, servants moving quietly in and out. Colonel Arbuthnot presided grimly, speaking little. Conversation was forced, until Clara, perhaps from nerves, perhaps from youthful rashness, burst out suddenly. "I cannot bear it any longer. We sit here like prisoners, each of us pretending innocence, while suspicion hovers over everything we do. Someone here knows the truth." The effect was electric. Lady Eleanor's knife clattered onto her plate. Mr. Grant flushed scarlet, while his wife's hand shook so violently she nearly dropped her glass. Dr. Price gave a short, dry laugh. "My dear young lady," he said smoothly, "you speak with commendable passion. But passion is not proof. We are all innocent until Monsieur Poirot says otherwise." Clara turned to Poirot, her eyes imploring. Tell them you know I had nothing to do with it." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Mademoiselle, I know that suspicion was arranged against you too neatly. That alone does not prove innocence, but it tells me this: you are not the spider in this web. You are the fly." Lady Eleanor gave a sharp exclamation. "You coddle her, Poirot. A girl of her age is perfectly capable of deceit." Poirot's eyes rested on Lady Eleanor. "And a woman of your pride, madam, is perfectly capable of cruelty." The words hung in the air like a blow. Lady Eleanor rose abruptly, her face pale, her hands trembling despite her attempt at dignity. "You insult me," she cried. "You insult us all with your insinuations." Poirot spread his hands. "I do not insult, madam. I observe. And I see that your pride is wounded more deeply than you would have it appear." Before she could respond, Mrs. Grant suddenly let out a sob. All heads turned as she pressed her hands to her face, pearls trembling at her throat. "I cannot bear it," she cried. "It is all too much. You cannot know what it is to live in fear day after day." Her husband reached for her arm, but she pulled away, her eyes wild. "Yes, Leonard, fear. Fear of your debts, your failures, your temper. And now this nightmare with the diamonds. Do you think I did not hear you last night, pacing the floor, muttering about fortune and ruin? Do you think I did not know you went out when you said you were with me?" There was a stunned silence. Grant's face turned a mottled crimson. "Margaret, for God's sake, hold your tongue." But the damage was done. Mrs. Grant sank back in her chair, trembling. "I swear I had nothing to do with it. But if you seek the truth, then look to him, not me." All eyes turned to Mr. Grant. He attempted bluster, but his voice faltered. "Nonsense, hysterical nonsense. My wife is overwrought. I never left my room." Poirot's gaze was steady, his voice soft. "Monsieur Grant, your wife has revealed what I suspected, that the alibi you offered each other was rehearsed. It is not proof of theft, but it is proof of lies." Grant slammed his fist upon the table. "Damn it, Poirot, you twist everything. If I am guilty, then where are the diamonds? Show them to me in my pocket, and I'll confess." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, monsieur, the diamonds are not in your pocket. But lies, they are heavier than jewels, and you carry them still." The luncheon ended in chaos. Lady Eleanor swept from the room with her head high, Clara fled in tears, Mrs. Grant collapsed into sobs, and Mr. Grant stalked out muttering curses. Only Dr. Price lingered, lighting a cigarette with a detached amusement that seemed almost rehearsed. Colonel Arbuthnot sat in stony silence, his hand clenched upon the table, his eyes fixed on Poirot as though demanding an explanation. When they were alone, Hastings whispered, "Well, Poirot, that settles it. Grant's the man, surely." Poirot shook his head. "Non. Hastings. Grant is a liar, yes. A fool, perhaps. But a thief. We shall see. Lies have many colors, and not all are crimson. Some are pale as ivory, some faint as violet. And until I have them all arranged, I do not name the thief." He turned, his eyes shining. "But we are close, mon ami. Very close. Today the lies have begun to surface. Tomorrow," he tapped his temple gently, "tomorrow we cast the net." The atmosphere in Wexley Court that evening was tense, charged like the air before thunder. Servants went about on tiptoe, aware that every whispered word, every clink of china, seemed magnified in the hush. The guests, once assembled for laughter and sport, now moved like shadows through the rooms, bound together by suspicion yet divided by mistrust. Poirot alone seemed serene. He dined little, conversed sparingly, and retired early, though Hastings knew better than to assume his mind rested. He had seen the gleam in Poirot's eye, the little twitch of the mustaches that told him the famous detective had reached a decision. Hastings longed to demand the answer then and there, but Poirot only shook his head and said softly, "Patience, mon ami. Tomorrow we arrange the scene. The truth, she will come forth when the actors believe they play unseen." The next day dawned with a pale sun. After breakfast, Poirot requested that the household gather in the library. They came reluctantly, Lady Eleanor stiff with indignation, Mr. Grant muttering under his breath, Mrs. Grant pale and silent, Clara anxious, Dr. Price faintly amused, the Colonel grim as stone. Hastings sat in his accustomed chair, notebook in hand, his heart beating with anticipation. Poirot stood before the empty fireplace, his hands folded, his eyes roving keenly from face to face. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, "we have looked at the facts. We have examined safes, footprints, fibers, wax. Yet the greatest clue is not in steel or cotton, but in the heart. Each of you hides something, and today we shall bring those secrets into the light." Mr. Grant gave a blustering laugh. "More theater, Poirot. If you had proof, you'd have shown it days ago." "Proof, monsieur," Poirot said gently, "is not only in the finding of objects, it is also in the finding of contradictions. Let us, therefore, consider the contradictions." He turned first to Lady Eleanor. "You said, madam, that you retired to your room at 10:15, wrote 2 letters, and did not stir thereafter. Yet one of those letters bears a trace of wax upon its edge, wax identical to that upon the safe. How do you explain this?" Lady Eleanor drew herself up. "I cannot. I only know I did not go near the safe." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet you wear violet scent, the same faint trace Hastings perceived upon the lock." Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze. "If you choose to believe I crept about like a thief, so be it. I tell you I did not." Poirot inclined his head and moved on. "Monsieur Grant, your alibi was supported by your wife. And yet your wife revealed that you left your room. She spoke in fear, not malice. Why did you deceive us?" Grant's fists clenched. "I went out for air. I couldn't sleep. I walked the corridor, nothing more. If that damns me, then let it." Poirot turned to Mrs. Grant, whose eyes filled with tears. "And you, madam, you fear your husband's debts. You fear his temper. But tell me, is it fear of him that makes you tremble, or fear of yourself?" She gasped. I swear, I never touched those diamonds. I only wished to be free of the burden." Clara spoke then, her voice quavering. "It isn't fair. You look at me as though I were guilty, but I had nothing to do with it. Someone planted that leather scrap to make it seem so. I know it." Poirot regarded her with gentleness. "Yes, mademoiselle, someone arranged suspicion against you. That is certain." Dr. Price exhaled a ring of smoke, his expression ironic. "So much melodrama. Shall we all confess to something we did not do? It seems the fashion." Poirot's eyes turned sharply upon him. "You, doctor, are a man of science. You claim precision, logic. Yet when I asked you of the night, you gave me times too exact, too rehearsed. Why such precision, unless you feared to be thought vague?" Price smiled thinly. "Is punctuality now a crime?" Poirot spread his hands. "Not a crime, doctor, but a mask. And masks, they slip." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the great clock in the hall. Then Poirot spoke again, his tone decisive. "This evening, I ask you all to gather once more in the library. By then, the truth will have revealed herself. Until then, remain within the house. No one leaves, no one enters. The trap, she is set. One by one, the guests departed, their footsteps heavy. Only Hastings remained with Poirot. He leaned forward eagerly. "Well, Poirot, you know, don't you?" Poirot smiled, a smile both proud and grave. "Yes, mon ami. I know. The diamonds are closer than anyone believes. And tonight, before this very fire, the thief will be unmasked." Evening descended upon Wexley Court with a hush that felt unnatural. The last traces of storm had long gone, leaving the sky clear and cold. The great house, however, was restless. Lamps glowed behind heavy curtains, footsteps echoed faintly in corridors, doors clicked shut, and whispers died away as Poirot's summons spread through the rooms. By 8 o'clock, every guest was assembled in the library. The air was heavy with expectation, the fire in the grate casting long, wavering shadows. Colonel Arbuthnot stood stiffly by his desk, his expression grim. Lady Eleanor sat erect, her face pale but proud. Mr. Grant paced with nervous energy, while Mrs. Grant huddled in her chair, twisting her pearls until the strings strained. Clara perched anxiously near the fire, eyes darting to Poirot as if he were her sole hope. Dr. Price leaned back, arms folded, a faint, sardonic smile on his lips. Hastings, faithful as ever, sat at Poirot's side, notebook forgotten in his lap. Poirot entered last, calm, precise, immaculate. He took his place by the hearth, hands folded delicately before him, and allowed the silence to stretch until every eye was upon him. Then he spoke. "Mesdames, messieurs, we arrive at the end of our little drama. The Arbuthnot diamonds, they have not disappeared into thin air. No, they are here, within these walls. And tonight, you shall know who has taken them." There was a stir, an intake of breath, a clatter of Mr. Grant's pacing foot, the faint rustle of Clara's gown. Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Let us recall. The safe, opened not with brute force but with skill. The wax upon the lock, the faint fiber of cotton, the brass key misplaced, the footprint of a servant's shoe. These are details, yes, but together they compose a pattern. And in that pattern, Immerse, lies the truth." He turned first to Lady Eleanor. "Madam, you left letters upon the hall table. One bore traces of wax, like that at the safe. You wear violet scent, which Hastings detected upon the lock. Suspicion points to you. Yet you are too proud, too disdainful of money, to stoop to theft. Non, your role is not that of thief, but of one whose pride made her conceal something. That concealment was of no consequence to the jewels." Lady Eleanor's eyes flashed, but she said nothing. Poirot turned to the Grants. "Monsieur Grant, your debts are heavy. Madame Grant, your fear is heavier still. You both lied about your movements, but lies of weakness, not of design. You left your room, yes. You feared discovery, yes. But you did not open the safe. For neither of you possesses the skill or the daring." Mr. Grant gave a snort of relief, while his wife sagged in her chair as though a burden had lifted. Poirot faced Clara. "Mademoiselle, the fragment of Morocco leather was placed where you had sat. A child's trick, to turn suspicion. You are innocent, though your eagerness betrayed you. But you, too, are not the thief." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Thank you." Then Poirot's gaze rested on Dr. Price. The room seemed to contract. "You, doctor, you are precise, too precise. You gave your times with the care of one who had rehearsed. You mocked the search for clues, the measuring of carpets, the examination of trifles. You mocked because you feared. The fiber of cotton, such as might cling to a physician's handkerchief. The wax upon the lock, such as a man might carry if he prepared an impression of the colonel's key. The footprint, small, narrow, not yours, but that of a maid's shoe. A clever misdirection, planted by one who knows how to use the tools of deception. It was you, doctor, who staged these little fragments to point elsewhere." Dr. Price laughed lightly, but his voice trembled. "Really, Poirot, this is absurd. A country physician, a safe-cracker? Preposterous." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but you are no ordinary physician. You served in the war, did you not? In the medical corps. And after, you worked briefly in London. In Harley Street? Yes, I made inquiries. And before Harley Street, a brief scandal, quickly hushed. An interest in chemistry, in lock mechanisms, in matters outside your profession. A talent, doctor, which has found its use again. Dr. Price's face paled. Poirot lifted a small envelope from the mantelpiece. This afternoon, I examined once more the safe. Hidden within the hinge, I found a sliver of rubber softened by heat, used to dampen the sound of tampering. A medical rubber, doctor. The sort only you would carry. There was a gasp from Clara. Colonel Arbuthnot stepped forward, his face purple with fury. By heaven, Price, is this true? Poirot's voice cut through the outcry, sharp and commanding. And where are the diamonds, you ask? Not far. They were not carried away, not hidden in stables or gardens. They are here, in the very house, concealed where a doctor would feel most secure. In the lining of your medical bag, doctor, which you have not allowed out of your sight since the theft. The room erupted, shocked cries, denials, exclamations. Dr. Price rose abruptly, his composure crumbling. His smile faded, and his hand went to the bag at his side as though to shield it. For a moment he seemed about to speak, then he sat heavily, head bowed. It is true, he said hoarsely. Yes, I took them. I thought, the colonel has wealth, reputation, all his honors. I have nothing but debts, drudgery, obscurity. Why should he keep what he does not even wear, while I struggle? I thought I could take them, sell them abroad, vanish. But you, Poirot, you see too much. Poirot bowed his head gravely. It is not only seeing, doctor. It is understanding. Theft is never only of jewels. It is of dignity, of peace. You have stolen both from yourself. Colonel Arbuthnot's voice rang like a trumpet. The police shall deal with you. Poirot raised a hand. Yes, the police must come. But for now, let us be thankful. The diamonds are safe. The truth, she is restored. And though human folly cannot be cured by law alone, at least justice will have her day. The guests sat in stunned silence, the crackle of the fire loud in their ears. Hastings, his heart pounding, looked at Poirot with admiration undimmed by years. Once again, the little Belgian had untangled the web with brilliance, logic, and psychology. Poirot, serene, adjusted his cuffs. It is finished. The library of Wexley Court still bore the marks of the storm within. The fire had burned low, the lamps cast a tired glow, and the guests, drained of their vitality, sat as though each had weathered not one night of suspense but a long campaign. Colonel Arbuthnot had withdrawn to his study with the police, who had arrived at last through mud and fallen branches to take charge of Dr. Price. The doctor had gone quietly, his medical bag in hand, his head bowed, not with contrition, but with the resignation of a man who knows the game is lost. In the aftermath, silence fell heavily. Lady Eleanor sat upright, her eyes glittering with triumph that was not hers. Mr. Grant muttered to himself, pacing, while Mrs. Grant clutched her pearls with hands that trembled more from relief than sorrow. Clara, pale but composed, looked toward Poirot with something like gratitude. Hastings, notebook long forgotten, could not keep his eyes from his friend, whose little gray cells had once again worked their miraculous order out of chaos. Poirot, for his part, seemed calm, even weary. He sat by the fire, fingertips together, speaking softly into the hush. You see, Ammius Amos, it was never the diamonds alone. They were merely the bait. What matters is always psychology. Dr. Price wished to distract suspicion, so he created clues. The wax upon the lock, the scrap of leather by Mademoiselle's chair, the footprint upon the corridor carpet, all these were not clumsy accidents. They were stagecraft, designed to point the finger elsewhere. But he was too careful, too neat. A true accident leaves jagged edges, his left only straight lines. Clara leaned forward. Then it was never me? Poirot bowed. No, mademoiselle. You were chosen as the scapegoat. Young, curious, impulsive, your eagerness made you a perfect decoy. But you were innocent. Lady Eleanor's lips curved in a thin smile. And what of me, Monsieur Poirot? You spoke often of pride. Was that too a decoy? Poirot's eyes softened. Madam, pride was your danger, not your guilt. You concealed too fiercely. You thought to hide the scent upon your glove, the letters upon the table. But concealment breeds suspicion. Had you spoken freely, no eye would have turned toward you. Remember this, silence, when it is needless, is as dangerous as speech, when it betrays. She inclined her head stiffly, but her lips trembled. Poirot turned to the Grants. Monsieur Grant, your debts, Madam, your fear. You both lied. But lies of weakness are not lies of crime. You have one another, and that, if you will permit me to say so, is more precious than any diamond. Do not squander it in deception. Mr. Grant looked away, shame dulling his usual bluster. Mrs. Grant's eyes filled with tears. At last, Poirot addressed Colonel Arbuthnot, who had returned during the explanation. The old soldier stood erect, though lines of weariness had deepened on his face. Colonel, you kept your jewels locked away for years, fearing thieves. Yet it was not an outsider who came, but one admitted by your own trust. Remember this, mon Colonel, the strongest safe is not steel, but discernment of character. Guard that more jealously than gems. The Colonel gave a stiff bow. Monsieur Poirot, I owe you the thanks of a lifetime. Wexley Court will not forget. Poirot rose, adjusting his cuffs, his eyes distant. Do not thank me, Colonel. Thank only order, logic, and the truth. For without them, the world is a storm without end. With them, even in the darkest night, there is clarity. He turned to Hastings. Come, mon ami. The case is finished. The diamonds will go to the bank once more, the police will have their prisoner, and life will resume its polite rhythms. But for Hercule Poirot, there is no triumph, only the satisfaction of the little gray cells at work. As they stepped into the hall, Hastings could not help exclaiming, By Jove, Poirot, you never fail to astonish me. How you put it all together, I shall never quite understand. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes half closed in thought. It is not astonishment, Hastings. It is simplicity. To see what is, and not what one wishes to see. That is the secret. They paused at the great door of Wexley Court. Outside, the sky was pale, the lawns glittered in morning frost, and the world seemed cleansed of storm. Poirot drew his coat neatly about him, straightened his hat, and murmured, almost to himself, Another mystery ended, another soul undone. Yet always the same truth, mon ami. It is not the jewels that vanish, but honesty. With that, he stepped into the crisp air, Hastings beside him, and left Wexley Court behind, its secrets laid bare, its dignity scarred but preserved.